Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our interview with Derek Leatherdale. Derek is a managing director at GRI Strategies, and Derek has been supporting companies across industry sectors to develop a resilience and thrive amidst increasing global geopolitical volatility. Derek was a founder at HSBC's group Geopolitical Risk Function and associate director at the Risk Coalition, leading a risk thinking think tank on corporate management and geopolitical risk. Derek is also author of Geopolitical Risk course on Global Risk Academy, which you can check it out on globalriskacademy.com website. So Derek, welcome to our Risk Management Show podcast today.
Hi, Boris. Thanks very much indeed for having me.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure. So, Derek, I believe that we will have a very thoughtful conversation on the topic of geopolitical risk management. But before that, could you please tell us a short story about yourself, your career path, and what brought you to where you are right now, and what you guys at GRI Strategies are up to this day?
Yeah, I'll try and keep this as brief as possible. I started my career in the public sector, working for government here in the UK, latterly in intelligence work, focused on counter-terrorism issues. But I then left government and joined HSBC in the group's global headquarters in London, and was slightly surprised to find that, particularly in the risk function, that there wasn't any kind of expertise or analytical capability on questions of geopolitical risk, particularly as they were relevant, or those issues which were strategically relevant to HSBC's business performance and wider operating model. And that's really where the GRI journey started. I ended up setting up the group's first geopolitical risk function. We sat within the wider risk function, ultimately reporting up to the group's CRO. And really that was a kind of process of trial and error, of learning as we went along. Because as we set up, we knew that there was a sort of analytical capability gap, but we had to work out where and how we should be trying to integrate geopolitical information and insights into internal decision making and internal risk management activity and processes. And I looked for advice and guidance at the time as we were setting up the function and starting to embed its work from sort of external experts, from external consultancies, and indeed external political risk consultancies. Some of your listeners, Boris, may be familiar with some of the main political risk consultancies that exist. Organizations like Eurasia Group, organizations like the Economist's Intelligence Unit, and a range of others offer political risk analysis. But really across that sort of field of external organizations, I couldn't find anyone who could offer advice on how you get to grips within a large, complex organization like HSBC with the notion of geopolitical risk, and where and how you should start channeling the insights that consultancies can provide, where and how you channel those into internal decision making and risk management processes. So I kind of had to make it up for myself, Boris, as I was working through this process. And it was a process of nearly 7 years or so before I then handed over the team to my successor. I then went on to a government affairs role in HSBC, which was sort of a slightly different take, if you like, on questions of public policy and advocacy. But when I left the bank, I felt very strongly that experience of trying to introduce and embed more systematic approaches to geopolitical risk management in commercial organizations was one that would become increasingly relevant as the global geopolitical context sort of, if you like, became more volatile, and that there were very few other organizations out there with anything really to say on how you do this, and how risk managers and heads of risk can really approach these questions more effectively. And I kind of wanted to help them, almost to let them learn from my mistakes and come to a more effective risk management approach rather more rapidly than I have been able to in HSBC. So that's really what we in GRI do, Boris. I kind of say very frequently to organizations with whom we're engaging, what we're not as an organization is yet another purveyor of punditry. I don't go on to CNN to offer my thoughts on whatever the latest geopolitical risk issue is. Yes, I've got a wide range of perspective and insight on which I can draw around geopolitical risk issues, but actually the bulk of our focus is internally within organizations, helping them optimize decision making and risk management on this rather challenging area of risk. And therefore we end up engaging a lot with boards and their risk committees, but also engaging a lot with risk functions, risk management teams, heads of risk, and people who've got sort of a stake, if you like, in the way risks are managed in organizations.
Fantastic. Yeah, of course. Geopolitical risk has risen sharply in recent years, specifically in the wake of wars in Russia, Ukraine, in Middle East, and China-US relationships. But many firms have little experience in understanding how to convert these issues to internal work and structure. So could you please provide a brief overview what a geopolitical risk management entails in the company, and how do you define and identify geopolitical risks in today's global landscape?
So let me take the second part of that first, if I may, Boris. So on that question of definitions, I'm often asked, what is the correct definition? If you in a risk function have a risk taxonomy, then what's the right definition for geopolitical risk, and how do you kind of almost arrive at this academically pure, sort of doctrinally pure definition of geopolitics? I tend to advise turning that conversation on its head slightly, rather than advising risk functions, rather than worrying about arriving at a definition, a sort of precise definition. Think more about the risk impacts that geopolitics can have on your organization. And let me kind of underline that point with a personal observation. When I first got into HSBC, I think the sense at the time, the prevailing sort of corporate view was that there was a thing called political risk, but it primarily applied to a relatively small number of emerging markets, and that otherwise political risk as a concept didn't really sort of cut across activity, business activity or operations in developed markets and developed economies. And therefore you were only exposed as an organization to political risk if you have market operations or operational activity within the emerging market in question. And if the risk manifested, then yes, your local business entity, subsidiary would be affected, but more widely, your sort of wider business operation and business performance probably wouldn't be. That the risk was kind of principally a function of your geographic footprint and principally contained within a geography. That I think that whole paradigm has changed, and we talk a lot about a kind of a geopolitical risk paradigm 2.0, to try and sort of summarize that difference. These days, geopolitical risk cuts across developed economies and developed markets as much as emerging markets. And actually, increasingly, and I think this was sort of really brought home by the macroeconomic consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that actually it's the kind of second and third order macroeconomic consequences of geopolitical issues that increasingly affect companies. So to give you a very specific example, following events in February 2022, the oil price spiked, and it didn't matter as a business whether you were operating in Ukraine or Russia, or frankly anywhere else in the world. That one of the principal impacts would have been higher inflation, lower GDP growth, interest rates higher for longer, etc., etc. And I say all of that because I think increasingly trying to come back to the first element of my answer, trying to define this thing called geopolitics can become quite difficult. It's actually much more effective to start thinking about the range of impacts it might have on your organization, and to think in a new way that it's not principally a function of where you as an organization operate, but actually what your market, your wider market dependencies might be, whether that's changing levels of GDP growth, higher levels of inflation, reduced levels of customer demand, along with a range of operational impacts of the kind that I think people also more traditionally associate with geopolitical risk. Of course, the way those impacts bear on an organization will differ by the organization itself. It might have sort of its own, if you like, sort of tailored market dependencies that it might not have in common with other organizations. But it's trying to capture that impacts picture. And that sort of, I think, probably takes me to the next point, that one of the challenges in managing geopolitical risk is that I think traditionally has been that people haven't really been able to link these big external forces, events, issues, developments with concrete, tangible internal impacts. And without that second piece, sort of corporate approaches to geopolitical risk very often become a kind of a, to the extent they happen at all, can become a kind of internal talking shop. And then people move on to things that they can focus on, where they can see tangible impacts and consequences.
Mm-hmm. All right. So how do you kind of convert this theory to practical methodologies and frameworks?
Yeah.
What are you using for your assessment of geopolitical risk? And maybe how important is historical context in evaluating geopolitical risk? Maybe you have some kind of historical knowledge or database.
Yeah. On that latter point, Boris, and you, I'm sure, will have come across this, but you often find this particularly in a financial sector context, but also in the context of an increasing focus on climate change, that there is a strong tendency amongst particularly those who are working on quantitative modeling within a risk context in organizations, frequently want, if you like, the access to historical data to try and inform their modeling, and to try and inform how specific events might then have impacts on their organization. The challenge, I think, in respect of geopolitics is that the historical data sets and analogies that might otherwise be able to help are very far from perfect, and that actually we're in a sort of, if you like, a kind of a global era here that is to some extent out with any recent period of history that could otherwise provide sort of data or perspective. You can correlate, for instance, things like equity market moves or commodity market price moves with previous geopolitical episodes, if you like. So you will often see correlation, for instance, of events in the Middle East in the mid 1970s with oil market movements or equity market movements. But for a mixture of reasons, that as an analogy is not a perfect fit for events in 2024.
Yeah, exactly. Now we have events in the Middle East, but no spike in oil price, right?
Exactly that. So the historical data piece is it's part of the armory, if you like, of an approach to this, but it's just a sort of uncomfortable fact that it cannot provide, if you like, a total predictive power when you try and put it into the new context that is 2024. Just on the point about methodology, so we would recommend organizations, they start to think rather like banks are doing in climate modeling, of transmission channels, of how a geopolitical issue or event can start to track through to individual aspects of business performance. And you can track those elements across strategy, across financial performance, across non-financial and operational issues, across reputation, and a range of other things besides. And Boris, if memory serves, I think in the course that I put together, that you kindly host that there is an example template of how that approach can be applied within, in that case, a banking context, and how you can start to map impacts across different business lines within an organization. We typically recommend starting with a qualitative assessment, and we also would work with risk functions and say, don't just think about the direct impacts. Start to try and identify some of the indirect, some of the second and third order consequences that might flow from either a particular geopolitical trend or a geopolitical shock event. And once you can lay that out and start to identify some of those tangible impacts, so you can start to understand as a risk manager which area of impact might be more significant for your organization versus less significant, and you can then focus, resource and time and effort on the more significant, the areas of higher impact. And you can then start thinking about trying to model and put some quantitative measurement on those possible impacts. But when you think about it in those terms, if you think there might be strategic consequences, consequences for financial performance, consequences for operational issues or reputation, you can then start thinking about a more holistic series of mitigations, a kind of effectively a more all-encompassing mitigation strategy. That's where the framework that we developed, Boris, and you mentioned in your question, really comes in. It sort of articulates a way of working, particularly focused on risk functions and how they can operate both to drive better decision making within their organizations, but also use their existing risk activity and risk function processes and approaches and frameworks to drive more effective both impact assessment and then mitigation as needed. There's probably a piece in all of this, Boris, as well about opportunity. I was just on a call with someone else, but we were talking about the opportunity side of geopolitical risk. And I don't know if you saw, but the head of Goldman Sachs markets business announced that he was going to retire just before Christmas.
Commodities business, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just at the tender age of 49, having run that business unit for 3 years, but actually having over that 3-year period, it had been the best performing part of Goldman Sachs business. And part of the reason they've done so well is they have been trading the volatility in commodity markets, partly from events in Ukraine, partly from volatility elsewhere in the world. In a way, they've been on the right side of those trades, and that was calculated, and that was done deliberately, and they were able to make money from that volatility. And I know it sort of sounds perhaps a little bit sort of heartless, but actually from a corporate perspective, it's not all about downside risk, and you can use a framework, and you can use impact assessment methodologies to try and identify opportunities and potentially take advantage of them, or to use strategies like hedging or portfolio diversification to minimize any potential losses. So it's not all about sort of downside risk all of the time. There can be ways to use this to think more clearly and with more insight and confidence about potential opportunities.
Yeah, I heard about it. So you shared a kind of a very specific success story of companies
Yeah.
effectively navigating geopolitical challenges and making a profit of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, another example, Boris, for what it's worth, and again, it's not necessarily an easy message, but the one part of the global economy that actually performed better as a consequence of a geopolitical shock was the GCC and Middle Eastern economies more broadly, following the events in Ukraine, because higher oil prices track through to high levels of GDP growth in those economies, or in many of those economies. And actually, from a business point of view, then there's a potential to sort of maneuver, maybe redirect capital to those markets, redirect investment to those markets to take advantage of that. So yeah, it can be hard, sort of sometimes in a picture of increasing global volatility from geopolitics to think about the upsides, but from a business perspective, they are there,
Yeah.
and just
Yeah.
need some clear thinking to identify them.
You now can see in the problems with shipping in the Red Sea,
Yeah,
but actually the shipping companies now are profiting because their containers and their freights pricing more than before.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so it's very interesting that, and also defense companies, right? Defense companies
Yeah.
are profiting as well.
Definitely, that's a really interesting point, Boris. You know, coming from a banking background, and you may have come across this. There has, for many years, been a sort of an increasing view within banks that they should exit any
Uh-huh.
relationships they have with defense companies. There are a mixture of reasons, but broadly, you might sort of wrap them under the, if you like, the corporate sustainability
Yeah.
sort of heading. And actually, I think now there is a potential opportunity for banks to sort of re-engage with some of those defense companies if they're willing to rethink their risk appetite in engaging and providing services to those. But again, it's, you know, obviously that's a very industry sector specific, you know, sort of point. But the broader point you make about, you know, as governments globally are spending more on their militaries, you know, there are, you know, potential you know, upside opportunities to consider.
Mm. And what does do you have some assessment how technology plays a role in the monitoring and managing geopolitical risk? Is there something special technology, or is it just general GRC software? How does it work?
So definitely you can build in, once you've got the impacts sort of assessment piece in place. And by the way, developing that, we find, is an iterative process. And because the geopolitical context can change sometimes quite markedly and rapidly, so the impact assessment picture will also change. Uh, you can, I mean, there are some firms who provide quantitative measurements of geopolitical risk issues, and you can sort of draw on those in an organization. So in particular, for instance, the ratings agencies, generally speaking, in their country risk reporting, will provide numerical scores on political risk within a jurisdiction, similar, and that can be drawn on. We tend to say, by the way, in those circumstances, that, you know, that's perfectly fine and can make the process of trying to identify how likely a risk is to manifest, it can make it easier. But it's useful to try and overlay some qualitative assessment of those numeric quantitative scores. And ideally, that qualitative assessment should come from someone who's got some expertise in the issue, because inherently geopolitical issues are hard to reduce to a single number. And that very often, where they're drawn up by external consultancies, they don't necessarily, in those consultancies, have the expertise, but sort of really genuine expertise to draw at those numbers with confidence. So we tend, on that question of technology and quantitative measurement, we tend to say, you know, perfectly fine to use it, but if possible, you try and overlay some expert qualitative judgment to make sure that the numbers make sense, and that they can be kind of sense checked, if you like. And that's one element of the framework that I mentioned a few minutes ago. You know, looks at the way that kind of expertise can be applied to risk function activity. That's one sort of good example of where that can happen. Otherwise, we wouldn't recommend a particular standalone piece of technology or software that firms use. Actually, we find it's more effective, especially given the general state of maturity in risk functions on geopolitical questions, to leverage existing frameworks, existing processes, existing technology like GRC technology, rather than create something new. You know, maybe that can come in a few years' time, but in the meantime, it's quicker, easier, and gets more rapid impact to sort of go with the grain of what an organization already has.
Mhm. All right. I would like to ask you a personal point of view. What is the major misconception in the geopolitical risk space that you strongly disagree with?
Oh, right. Within a corporate context, there are two or three things I would point to. One is, I think, a general sense that, particularly for many in sort of senior roles in management teams, and I would include heads of risk in this, that many have spent much of the last 3 decades sort of building their careers, and just aren't really. And sorry, during that period of time, in the period after the Cold War ended, um, geopolitics really hasn't been a sort of a factor or a feature that they've ever really needed to take much account of or pay a huge amount of attention to. And I think that sort of, if you like, feeds into a general view amongst, I would apply this to some on boards as well as management teams, executive teams, that that geopolitics hasn't been a problem in the past and probably won't be a problem in the future. So we don't really need to think about it or do anything about it. That's certainly, I think, a kind of view of the world, a conception that is decreasingly tenable for any business of any sort of significant scale operating, even within a single domestic market, let alone internationally. So that's certainly one big sort of misconception I would point to and challenge. There are a couple of others which I think sort of flow from that. One is a sense that well, geopolitics is done by governments to other governments, and there's not much that we as a business can do about that. Perhaps we can do a bit of lobbying on the margins. Perhaps we can use a government affairs team or a public affairs team to try and convey messages, but whether they get any traction amongst public policymakers is debatable. But either way, there's very little we can do to sort of control the risk at source. And this is a classic risk function sort of mindset. What we can't control, there's no point worrying about. Another big one, as sort of associated point, is geopolitics as a risk is really hard to measure, and what we can't measure, we can't manage.
Mhm.
And so there's no point, no point doing anything with it. So I mean, I kind of sometimes think of these as being sort of almost cultural questions within firms. And it's interesting, to give a very good example, you'll recall, Boris, that for about 3.5 months before the invasion of Ukraine, uh, Western governments, and particularly Washington and London, were issuing a steady stream of
Mhm.
warnings about what they regarded as the potential scenario about to unfold. And I will quite often, when engaging with boards or heads of risk, sort of as one of the first questions, say, were you as an organization affected by the invasion of Ukraine, either directly? Did you have to withdraw an operation in Russia? Did you feel the downstream macroeconomic impacts? And actually, a surprisingly large number put their hand up and say, yes, we were affected by the macroeconomic consequences. I then ask, so what was when those intelligence warnings started to emerge towards the end of 2022, 2021? What did you, as a head of risk, or you on a board risk committee, or as a board member, think about doing to try and validate whether those warnings were there was some substance to them, or maybe you could safely ignore them? And quite often the answer is, well, we read in the newspaper that the odds were against Russia doing anything because a lot of the sort of the pundits, the people who write op-eds would saying Putin would be mad to do it. It would be an irrational move, so it probably won't happen. And I think in a way that's quite an interesting, sort of insight into the kind of corporate mindset and corporate approach that has characterized, a wider approach to geopolitical risk. That sort of broadly they're able to pick up a paper, and if it says something won't happen, then that's probably enough to, to avoid doing anything with it.
Yeah.
And of course, actually, we're now into a world coming back to the point we were discussing a few minutes ago, where the potential for geopolitical surprises, things that even experts would previously have said that's unlikely to happen. We're now into a world where those things that were unlikely have become at least more likely to consider. And you get then into that whole notion of, that's talked about in corporate governance, the idea of, looking at severe but plausible events, trying to understand how they might impact your organization, rather than as hitherto, sort of saying, well, it's less plausible, so we won't bother looking at it, and we'll focus on the lower impact, higher probability risks that face us.
Yeah, exactly. That's what kind of conception prisoners, right? The same was kind of in the Middle East, in Israel. They had the conception that Hamas will never dare to do such a raid. So they were not prepared. But yeah, that's always geopolitical risk on the highest level. So let's drill a little bit deeper. For example, how the risk managers should apply this. What should they prioritize right now when they dealing with geopolitical risk that they were not doing before?
I think probably two or three things internally, if that's what you mean. So one, I think, is to recognize, and this is, I think, probably almost of fundamental importance, that risk teams in the corporate sector generally have not seen access to geopolitical expertise, whether that's in-house of the kind that I was able to create in HSBC, or whether they draw on external consultancies, as necessarily a kind of core part of the skill set of operating effectively as a risk function. And so, one element of this, of all of this, and the way of thinking about more effective approaches, is to make sure, if you're a head of risk or in a senior risk role within a firm, to think about whether you've got the right skill sets and the right analytical information to help guide activity on geopolitical risk issues. So that's important. That's one thing I would sort of stress up front. But there is a second part, and having that expertise, having that analytical capability, whether in-house or outsourced or whatever combination, is not much good if nothing is then done with the information. And the analogy I tell is this: it's no good having someone in a risk function who sits in an office in the corner, jumping up and down, saying there's going to be war next week, and we need to think about its consequences, if everyone else in the risk function or the wider organization, is effectively ignores them. So it's important that that kind of expertise is then integrated into risk function activity, specifically in the case of this question. And then really, I would just encourage those listening to think, well, the potential points of integration are where we are managing financial risk. We need to think about how geopolitics might affect our financial risk profile and exposure, both directly and indirectly. We need to think about integrating with potentially strategic considerations, and whether geopolitics might be or play a role or have an influence on strategy. And to give you a very concrete example, whereas you probably come across instances where strategy teams, they'll be identifying new markets, and they'll be looking at the GDP growth projections or the forecasts for other macroeconomic variables, and identifying them therefore as markets that are potentially very valuable, or maybe in existing markets, and they're looking at putting more investment into or capital into those markets to take advantage of more favorable macroeconomic conditions. Well, actually, you can think about applying a geopolitical lens to those kinds of strategic decisions, and potentially it can just be a simple matter of sort of questioning whether those assumptions about future macroeconomic performance, whether they might be subject to some risk in future. And just sort of in that sense, kind of effectively providing a degree of challenge. The other thing is then integrating into operational risk activity. I think this is the bit where risk functions feel most comfortable, because for years many firms have had business continuity plans. They've had a sort of program to make sure that the facilities that they're operate, whether on the operational side, particularly on sort of supply of critical services, for instance, that there are plans in place to make sure that if those services are disrupted, there is some sort of backup. But definitely integrating and applying a geopolitical lens to the operational risk and resilience area of risk function activity is key. And I think then finally, as I mentioned earlier, also thinking about the potential reputational, consequences that can flow. And there are some interesting recent examples of that, of businesses who've either left Russia in a hurry and lost a great deal of money
Yeah.
in the process, or who haven't left Russia and are now being criticized by other stakeholders, or other businesses in the US, for instance, who are being increasingly criticized by legislators in Congress for their business activity in China. And the same goes the other way, by the way. I saw a piece only yesterday that the group chief executive of McDonald's had said that actually a number of customer boycotts of McDonald's in other countries is affecting their business performance, driven by those boycotts being driven by I don't quite know how best to describe it, but the appearance that McDonald's in Israel was providing food to Israeli Defense Force personnel, and that populations in other countries regarded this as bad and therefore were boycotting McDonald's. So there's definitely a reputational element to all of this as well. And I would encourage those in risk functions to sort of at least think about the link between geopolitics and then harness any geopolitical expertise to questions of reputational risk as well.
Fantastic. Okay. So that's were all my questions. Perhaps before we finish, I would like to remind our audience about the course that we have on our platform at globalriskacademy.com. You will just click on the course, and there will be 2 hours video course with Derek. Also, we have some additional bonuses like documents. Derek mentioned there is a geopolitical risk self-assessment template. There is a business impact assessment methodology and copy of practical guidance for building a geopolitical risk framework, and case studies of the firms and geopolitical risk mitigation strategy, and also possibility, of course, of a free follow-up consultation with Derek about half an hour or something like this. And then it's a fantastic course. We have many happy students, and I think we will continue with Derek, maybe to grow to more specific branches of this geopolitical risk. All right.
Great.
Thank you. Those were all my questions. So I just talk about our course, and Derek, thank you very much for your time today, and maybe a success with the GRI strategies, and maybe in a few months we will come back and discuss other things related to
Sounds
your
great.
expertise.
Thanks for having me, Boris. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.